Hello, and welcome to Catholic Lives, episode 10, The Night Prisoner. And we're resuming our Catholic Lives series here on controversies in church history. I've done it in about a year. Catholic Lives series, little mini biographies of Catholics who lived interesting, if not necessarily exemplary lives, but lives that are worth knowing about in history. And tonight, it deals with an interesting figure from the Middle Ages. So let's get into this episode with the Night Prisoner. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, presuming you're an English speaker, you probably know something about the figure of King Arthur. Remember King Arthur, his court at Camelot. He was the great king of the Middle Ages, the legendary figure, got his sword Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake. We know that. Even if you haven't read any King Arthur stories, you've probably seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You probably know tangentially about Merlin, the wizard who helps him become king when he comes into his own, takes the sword that's in the stone. You've probably seen stuff like this in your lifetimes or heard about it. Of how Merlin warns him against marrying his love, Guinevere, who does eventually, of course, become his king, but unfortunately, of course, will eventually fall in love with Sir Lancelot, who was one of his knights at his court, where, of course, he assembles all the greatest knights of the realm in Britain, Sir Lancelot, Sir Gawain, Sir Percival, so on and so forth. Knights of the Round Table, you've heard that probably at some point. Mentions Sir Lancelot, of course, is the greatest of the knights. He's the greatest knight in the world for adventures and for fighting with his sword and all this stuff. Becomes part of this story. Also, of course, winds up undermining, of course, the whole thing by falling in love with the queen, who is his sort of paramour. And then you probably have heard of the story of the Holy Grail. Right, the Grail, the cup, the legendary, it's a legend, of the cup that supposedly, Christ used at the Last Supper, made its way to England in medieval legend through Joseph of Arimathea, who actually gets into Arthurian legends. You probably know all this stuff. What you probably don't know is that all of this can be traced back to most of the stuff you're familiar with in the English-speaking world, one version of these stories, because there are many of these stories in the Middle Ages. And that story comes from a 15th century work called the Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, who wrote this work while he was in prison. Hence, he calls himself the Night Prisoner in his work. And so our life tonight is about Thomas Malory and how he came to write this book. And the tricky thing here is that scholars for a long time weren't exactly sure who Thomas Malory was. And the reason being is that there are something like 9 different Thomas Malorys in the historical records from the 15th century that could have been the guy who wrote the book. However, by the way, we don't have direct evidence of this, but without having done that, most scholars tend to agree at this point that the Sir Thomas Malory who wrote this book, we actually do know who he was and have something of his life, was a Sir Thomas Malory, was a knight whose estates were in a place called Newbold Revel in Warwickshire. If you know what Warwickshire is, it's a county in England, what they call the West Midlands. It's in the center of the country. You can't miss it. Warwickshire is where Shakespeare will be from. Born in Stratford-upon-Avon, that's where that's from. But he's from this manor house, Newbold Revel, which is not there anymore, the original house. There's one still there, the 18th century version that was built later on by another family. It's in use by the government for, I think, a prison or something at this point, but it's still there. But we think this is the man. And in fact, the name Malory, we mentioned there are 9 people in the Middle Ages who have this name, in the 15th century have this name. The name goes back to the Norman conquest, and it's almost certainly French. And in fact, the surname Malory is a Norman French nickname meaning unlucky. So that's something that could have only been coined after the Norman conquest of 1066. In any case, we know that his father, Sir John Malory, was active in the life of Warwickshire uh, prior to his life, obviously, in the 1400s. His father served 5 times as a member of Parliament in the 1400s, multiple times as sheriff in Warwickshire, multiple times as a justice of the peace, just to name a few different offices. He was widely respected, obviously, and trusted to have these offices. He was also someone who, records indicate it, seems to have been fairly devout. One modern historian has found evidence of a papal indult, which was granted to John Malory, Sir John Malory, and his wife Philippa in 1423, granting them permission to have mass before daybreak on their estate. And again, you think about this, what the evidence that means. It means they must have gone to mass daily, which would have been tough for them because this is a fairly decent sized estate. They probably had 10 or more servants. You can see he was a busy guy, all the things they had to do. The only way they could get to do it on a place like that was before daybreak. So it's interesting to think about this in light of his son's later life, which I'll get to in a moment. In addition to this, he had other relatives who were prominent in England in the 15th century, did Sir Thomas Malory. Another relative, whose exact relationship we're not sure of, Sir Robert Malory, was appointed prior of the Knights of St. John in 1432. The Knights of St. John was a crusading order, and meaning one of those orders that was formed originally for the Crusades. And he served in that capacity, did Sir Robert, until 1439. And in those 7 years, he actually had at one point the responsibility of assembling a fleet to send to the island of Rhodes in the Mediterranean Ocean, where the Knights of St. John held that territory, to prepare for to head off a potential Turkish invasion. He actually took the fleet to Rhodes. The Turks never showed up. But it must have been something to know that if you were Thomas Malory at the time, you had a relative who did such a thing. And then finally, he had one other relative, John Malory, again, maybe a cousin, we're not quite sure, who was also a member of the Knights Hospitaller, another one of these crusading orders that was still around after the Crusades, who was active in the 1460s and 70s, and was also in Rhodes himself in 1469, when we think Sir Thomas Malory wrote the Morte d'Arthur in prison. And so you have this fairly prominent family, not a great name, not a great family, as you'll see. And one of the things to note about this is that Sir John Malory, as prominent as he was, doesn't seem to have been terribly wealthy. One thing to keep in mind is a possible explanation, as you can see, for Thomas Malory's later life. They don't seem to have had that much money. And this is not that uncommon in the Middle Ages to have knights who had social standing but not a whole lot of money. So now, one of the things to talk about, okay, how does he come into all this? How does he come into the historical record? Now, Thomas Malory comes to the historical record, Thomas Malory of Newbold Revel, through his, well, as you're going to see, through the legal system, because he got in trouble with the law. He was imprisoned multiple times. That's how we know about his life, actually. And one of the things to note how this happens is that, good to get some background here. If you know anything about medieval society, it's run on a feudal basis, feudalism as an economic system where you have people giving, tenants on a manor giving their service to the local lord, as well as knights swearing allegiance to their vassals in exchange for land, those sorts of things. So it's both a political and economic system. Now, what happened toward the end of the Middle Ages in the 14th and 15th centuries is this began to be sort of eroded, this system of loyalties, this system of economics, by a couple of things. One is, you give your allegiance to a lord primarily because he's there to protect you. That's why you do that. But with the invention, of course, of gunpowder and guns, that sort of shifted the basis of warfare, which began to make the knights less and less important over time. Other thing that happened, of course, major thing probably, was the creation of a money economy. Cash became more and more important than giving things in kind, which was the original basis of feudalism as an economic system. And so you have that being sort of worn down this way. And so what happens is you have increasingly relationships shifting from hereditary, tenure, feudal relationships between lord and his servant, to personal, financial, and even contractual obligations. A lot of times this would be made by contract by this period, in which a retainer undertook to attend his lord whenever he was called for, suitably armed and equipped, in exchange for money, basically. And all this, by the way, coincides with the Hundred Years' War, which started in the 1330s, started by Edward III of England, who was trying to make good his claim on the French throne, and so it's what precipitates this in some regards. Now, what happens when a term for this that historians give this, and they give to this sort of modified system of feudalism, is called bastard feudalism, because it used to be thought that it was a major cause of the breakdown of society in the late part of the Middle Ages. It's not thought that way anymore, but it could be problematic. And the reason why is this: when a magnate no longer had any money to give his retainers, sometimes he would give them liveries as a substitute. What is a livery? Livery is sort of like a piece of cloth or a badge or something like this that signify that you were the retainer of that noble lord. You were his guy, right? And this became really popular. In fact, in many cases, liveries were as prized, if not more so, than money. Now, how could that be, right? Is money better than everything else? Well, here's what people did with their liveries. Because these liveries meant that, okay, if you wear this retainer, your lord has to take care of you, otherwise he'll lose his reputation as someone who takes care of his retainers. So, for an example, what you might do is, if you have a powerful lord on your side, let's say you get arrested, go for a jury of your peers in England, and you might go in there and wear that livery to signify to the jury, hey, if you don't give me the right verdict, my lord's going to come and punish you. And this happened. We know this because there were complaints about this. There were complaints in Parliament about this in the 1380s, complaining about people trying to escape justice in law courts through the patrons of lords whose liveries they wore in these trials. And in fact, there were a series of laws passed by Parliament throughout the 13 and 1400s trying to sort of curb all this stuff. Again, historians debate, how big of a deal this was. Mostly, if you had a strong leadership at the top, if you had a strong king, he could put a stop to this sort of thing. So, as long as you had a good king, a strong king, things were okay. Unfortunately, if you had a bad king or a weak king who really couldn't keep control of his great magnates, then you might fall into some serious trouble. We'll get to this in a moment. This is exactly what happens. But this is all to keep in mind. This is what Thomas Malory was. He was a knight who was a retainer of great lords. And in particular, as you get to the, he becomes of age in 1434. He's about 24 years old. But in the middle of the 1440s, you have a couple of major magnates fighting for control, primacy, if you like, in Warwickshire. One is a man named Richard Neville, who's from the north, but he becomes the Earl of Warwick in 1446. He'll later be known as the Kingmaker for reasons that are apparent. Who has rival for power is the Duke of Buckingham. And in particular, he must have been, Thomas Malory, on the side of Richard Neville, because as you're going to see, he comes into conflict with the Duke of Buckingham fairly quickly with the end of the 1440s, even though at the same time he is still performing, and he does for the first part of his life, first 10, 15 years of his life, lived the life apparently his father did. We have records of Thomas Malory serving in Parliament several times. He serves as a sheriff, justice of the peace. He does things like he witnesses as a legal witness for marriages for relatives and stuff like this. But all this is going to change in 1450, as you're going to see. As you're going to see, he turns to brigandage, basically. In 1450, for reasons we still don't quite don't understand, he turns to a life of crime, apparently. With 26 men in that year, 1450, he ambushed the Duke of Buckingham and tried to kill him. He also stole livestock. He was accused of a lot of different things in legal documents. He's accused of raping the same woman twice. At one point, he led a small army of 100 men and attacked an abbey called Combe Abbey in his area, terrifying the monks and stealing their money and valuables. And Malory was arrested in 1452, probably on Buckingham's Buckingham's insistence, and then throw him to jail. And he spends the better part of the next 8 to 10 years in prison. That's how we know about where he's at. Now, step back for a second. Okay, what's all this going on here? Well, one of the things that's in the background of all this bastard feudalism stuff, is of course the Wars of the Roses, in which because you've had a change of dynasties in 1399, the Duke of Lancaster overthrows the last Plantagenet king, Richard II, makes himself king, and kind of sets bad president, obviously. He does okay. His son, Henry V, restarts the 100 Years' War, takes over parts of France, marries a French princess, and he has a son, Henry VI, who comes to the throne. Now, you remember when I said that bastard feudalism probably is not a big of a deal as long as you have a strong king. Henry VI was a very pious guy. He was definitely known as a very devout Christian, someone who was basically a decent human being, unlike a lot of his contemporaries. Unfortunately, he also inherited a disease from his mother. His French mother had inherited a disease from her father, the French king, who had sort of lost his mind periodically, as would Henry VI. Several times during the 1450s and 1460s, he is incapacitated, and he will have to be, the government will have to fall into hands of people who, particularly someone who Parliament will nominate, Lord Protector. And so this means that the great magnates no longer have any incentive to restrain their subordinates. People like, you see the image here if you're watching the YouTube video, this is a picture image of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who gets involved in all this. He gets called the Kingmaker because, as you're going to see, he's going to help a new claimant get on the throne in the 1460s. And the guy he helps get on the throne is Richard, the Duke of York, image of him in 1445. Who in the 1450s is actually made Lord Protector, but when in 1455 Henry recovers from this, Richard was not about to relinquish power, so you begin to have a civil war breakout. The first Battle of St. Albans takes place in 1455. Eventually, in a few years later, in the 1459 or close to that, Richard is actually killed. Eventually, by 1462, they manage to defeat the forces of Edward, the Duke of York, the Lancastrian forces. They take control of the king and establish their dynasty, and Edward IV will become king at that point. Now, again, one of the things to explain Malory's behavior, just to give you an idea of just how widespread this brigandage is during this period. I mentioned that he was he attacked an abbey at one point. There were monks that he terrorized. It turns out one of the abbots that he was actually terrorizing at that monastery had himself been arrested for theft at one point in his time, apparently. This was a time when a lot of subordinates of great lords went on rampages. Whether because they just wanted to, whether they needed money, we don't really know. We do know that the Lancastrians thought of him as being a very dangerous prisoner. He spent most of the 1450s in prison, as I've mentioned, and he was put there and never put on trial. Apparently, the Duke of Buckingham didn't want to bring him to trial. Thought maybe they couldn't convict him, so they just kept him there. And not only did they keep him there, Duke of York, when he was the protector in the Lord Protector in the 1450s, tried to issue a pardon to him that was dismissed under suspicious circumstances. His jailers at the various prisons he was in were threatened with extraordinary fines if he escaped, over £1,000. This is the Middle Ages, £1,000 for letting this guy escape. And he was twice bailed out of prison by Yorkist lords. And he was moved around constantly, several times, for what looked like security reasons. And when you think about it, it makes sense, because apparently in all the sort of dealings, all the accusations against him, Sir Thomas Malory must have been a very, very charismatic person, because he had an ability to summon up small numbers of men to go fight at a very short notice. So that's one of the reasons why he was a kind of a dangerous dude, in other words, in the middle of all this. So yeah, he basically turns to being a thug. And in fact, that's one way you can describe the Wars of the Roses. It's kind of like gang warfare at a national level. The whole idea of liveries kind of suggests that. In any case, when he's released finally by 1462, he's fighting on Yorkist side under the protection of his magnate, Earl of Warwick. He joins a campaign to retake several castles in the north for the Yorkists. However, a few years later, in later 1460s, he apparently, when his patron, the Earl of Warwick, switches sides, he gets tired of Edward IV. He will switch sides, and he will follow him against going into the lists against Edward IV, which we know because in 1468, Edward IV issues a pardon for Lancastrians who'd been for Lancastrians, and he was specifically excluded from it in 1468. He'll also be excluded from another list in 1470. And so presumably he's back in prison by 1468, and he won't be free until 1470, because what happens in 1469 is that the Earl of Warwick, again, turns on Edward IV, trying to overthrow him. It doesn't work. They wind up sort of patching things up. But in 1470, he finally makes common cause with the Lancastrians who were in France. He brings them over, and they defeat Edward in 1470 in October of that year. And that's when Malory is finally released. And then he dies 5 months later in 1470. Shortly after he dies, Edward IV comes back, actually kills the Earl of Warwick in battle, and retakes the throne. He had been held, Thomas Malory, up till then in Newgate Prison, and that's where he was when he died. Mentioned Edward the Duke of York, Edward IV, the King of York, the Yorkist king, I should say. And I mentioned he dies shortly after getting out of prison. He spent most of his time in 1469 and 70 in Newgate Prison. He's buried just across the road at a place called Greyfriars, Newgate, which was the most fashionable church in London. And under a marble tombstone with an epitaph which described him as, quote, Thomas Malory, Valens Miles, Thomas Malory, Thomas Malory, whatever you pronounce it in Latin, but Thomas Malory, valiant knight. Which, again, shows, again, what kind of charismatic person he must have been. But you might be thinking, I mean, this guy, well, you know, this knight sounds like a kind of an awful person to a certain degree. We're not sure, by the way, all the accusations against him are actually true. We only have the accusations. We don't know exactly the background of all the accusations against him. But he seemed to have turned to a life of, you know, again, like almost pretty much brigandage and thuggery. And so how did he, when he was in this prison, this is where he wrote it in Newgate Prison, was buried in the Greyfriars Churchyard. Greyfriars means a reference to Franciscans, which is no longer there today. It was actually destroyed. His tomb was actually destroyed in 1538 when Henry VIII's Reformation started taking things over. The church that's there today, Christ Church, Greyfriars, is abandoned. So later church was abandoned after World War II, as well as the damage that was done to it by German bombers. But it leaves us with that question: how did this guy, who was such a thug, write what may be the greatest work on, you know, nobility and chivalry in all of literature? So a couple of things to note about this. He wrote this book, well, again, while he was in prison. We only have, well, the edition of it comes down to us. We only have a couple of manuscript copies. We think he finished it by into 1470 before he got out of prison. And then it was later on, it was picked up by William Caxton, one of the first English printers, and printed and published in 1485 with a preface by William Caxton. And in fact, William Caxton is actually one that gave the title "The Morte d'Arthur" to it. Malory's title he gave the book was "The Whole Book of King Arthur and His Knights of the Round Table." And one of the things it needs explaining is, okay, how did he write this in prison? You know, what are prisons like in the Middle Ages? Well, they can be bad. They can be pretty awful. On the other hand, if you're of enough status, enough wealth, you can live pretty comfortably in prison. And this must have been the case with him in Newgate, because he must have had access to a really killer library to write what he wrote. Because the Morte d'Arthur is basically a compendium and reshaping of the Arthurian tradition as it had come down to him from the 12th century, from Geoffrey of Monmouth, his history of Britain, monument of the history of kings of Great Britain, as well as the French Romance tradition of Arthurian stories. And in fact, Malory in the book several times notes that he is careful to have only consulted what he calls, quote unquote, the authorized books on the subject. And so he takes his source material and he creates this, again, this overview of the whole story of King Arthur. It's written 21 books, covers the story of the founding of Arthur's kingdom. You probably know the tale, won't go through it. The son of Uther Pendragon, who basically committed adultery to have Arthur. This happened several times. Actually, the two major figures in this are actually the result of adultery, or at least out of wedlock sexual activity, Arthur and Sir Galahad. But founding of his kingdom, the institution of the Round Table, all the great adventures that he has, or Lancelot has, or Gawain has, all that good stuff. The quest for the Holy Grail, which is of course part of the story, comes most likely from France, ending with the death of Arthur and the fall of his kingdom. And it is meant to be this sort of epitome of the true knight. The focus of the book is knighthood and chivalry. And so that first question, okay, how does this guy write this when he seemed to live a kind of less than chivalrous life? Well, one of the things I think is the key to it is something that kind of struck me, and this is the reason why I'm giving this, recording this, is that a lot of modern scholars have seen in the Morte d'Arthur a mostly secular work, which surprises me. Meaning they think it's mostly about knighthood and adventures, and it is. Mostly it is them going on adventures and fighting and stuff like that. And that's really the heart of it, which, again, in a way, yes, it's true, but it seems to me to miss what are the obvious signs, not just not signs, but the very strenuous Christian symbolism of the whole book. Now, this probably has to do with the fact that modern scholars recognize that certain elements of the story, the Grail, Excalibur, have pre-Christian roots. Stories of magical cups go back to Celtic mythology, pre-Christian Celtic mythology. This may have maybe part of the influence of people like Sir James Frazer, if you know who that is. The writer who wrote a work called The Golden Bough in the early part of the 20th century, which posited that all these sort of stories about, long story short, he basically posited that a lot of these stories that we think are Christian in books like Morte d'Arthur are actually, basically pagan literary types. But however that may be the case, the sheer wiping away of every Christian element from the story, I think, misses the point, because I think Christianity is very important to this, actually. And growing up, I when I imbibed this Arthur story, it mostly came through secular sources. The one I'm thinking of is the film Excalibur. If you haven't seen this, I think it's 1981. It's a good film by John Boorman, but it strips away almost every single Christian aspect from the story. It's completely pagan. It's basically sort of like a Richard Wagner opera or something like this. And so what does it miss? And why does that explain, the discrepancy between his life and that work and why it was what he did? We'll just give you a couple of examples from the book. Sacraments play a huge role in the play, in the book, I should say. Infants who are born out of wedlock or in wedlock, such as Sir Galahad, are immediately baptized. That's important to these characters in the book. Sir Palamedes, who's described as a Moor and therefore probably a Muslim in the book, is told he cannot be saved by King Arthur at his court if he's not baptized, which he does eventually get baptized. Characters go to mass throughout the Morte d'Arthur. But probably above all, penance plays a crucial role in many of the stories. The most crucial, of course, being the Grail story, because the knights had to purify themselves of their sins before they can go on that quest, so they can see the Grail. And in fact, only Sir Galahad in the end is found worthy to do this because of his purity. At another point in the story, one of the knights going on adventures with a guy named Sir Bors happens upon a priest and then asks him to give him confession, which he does. again, because he's trying to purify him. So all these things are scattered throughout this work. Plus, just the temporal framework of the Morte d'Arthur is framed in terms of the feast of the Christian calendar. Over and over again, he talks about how this happened after, 2 weeks after the Feast of Pentecost, or this happened after the Feast of Easter and stuff like this. So on and on throughout the actual book. And then finally, just the way the book ends. At the end of the book, I'm not going to spoil it for you if you haven't read it. Sir Lancelot and the remaining Knights of the Round Table at the end of the work all enter a hermitage and do penance for most of the rest of their lives. Lancelot actually dies there. In Malory's version, he actually has the remainder of the knights go off to the Holy Land and fight the Turks before dying. Sort of coming back to that chivalric crusader idea, which, he had relatives who did this. So in effect, it is knighthood at the heart of this, but it is very much a Christian version of knighthood that Malory has. I think this is the key to understanding why a guy who acted like he did in the 1450s could write a book like this. However much you want to, talk about the pre-Christian roots of it, of knighthood and chivalry, which they do have them, they were Christian ideals for Malory. And in fact, the Christian church had made an effort to Christianize knighthood. That's partly what explains the Crusades. These religious orders were meant to give, a Christian role for guys who were otherwise pretty violent. And what role was that? If you're a member of one of these, crusading orders, you protect pilgrims, you protect widows, you protect orphans, you protect, you don't go out and bash people's heads in. It still haven't a lot, but still, that was the ideal, right? Just as, by the way, the more secular ideal, the sort of idea of chivalric love and, sublimated love for a noble woman and all this stuff, they both had the same goal in the Middle Ages, which was to soften the behavior of these sometimes unruly knights. And so what you get in the Morte d'Arthur is a summation of ideals of Christian knighthood and chivalry, which probably Malory saw around him breaking down. Both historical forces, but also the deeds of men, his own contemporaries, himself, partly responsible for undermining this. And so one of his modern biographers actually suggested that perhaps it was a guilty conscience that made him write this book. Perhaps he felt guilty for having abandoned Henry VI, who was, yes, lost his mind, but was otherwise a good and decent king. There's definitely a sense in reading the Morte d'Arthur that Malory probably didn't like people like the Duke of York that much. He seemed to blame these overmighty magnates for causing a lot of these problems by being disloyal to their Christian king. One last thing to note about Malory is that we may miss this when you read the book, talking about the Christian element in it, if you're a modern scholar or something, perhaps because he was a layman. Because in the book, it is very much a layman's idea of Christianity, a layman's idea of faith that you get, not a priest or a theologian's. And so it's very much a matter of that, a matter of the heart rather than the head. And in fact, as C.S. Lewis put it, the sort of Christian idea of Christian civilization that is presented in the Morte d'Arthur, here I'm quoting here, quote, is a civilization of the heart, a fineness and sensitivity, a voluntary rejection of all the uglier and more vulgar impulses. It makes the Morte d'Arthur, the Morte, a noble as well as a joyous book, unquote. And so perhaps we can see this book as an act of penance for Sir Thomas Malory's misdeeds. And that will explain, why the disconnect. He probably felt the disconnect. And at least if he couldn't live up to it, put forth this, inspiring model of what it should have looked like, this idea of the Christian knight, toward the end of his life. And so I'll leave you with the last words of the Morte d'Arthur, which he comes to at the end of his book, as a sort of illustration of this, and of his, again, deeply flawed, obviously, Christian life, but sincere Christian beliefs. And so here's the quotation. Here is the end of the book of King Arthur and of his noble knights of the Round Table, that when they were whole together, there was ever 140. And here is the end of the death of Arthur. I pray you all, gentlemen and gentlewomen, that readeth this book of Arthur and his knights, from the beginning to the ending, pray for me while I am alive. Then God send me good deliverance, and when I am dead, I pray you all pray for my soul. For this book was ended the 9th year of the reign of King Edward IV, by Sir Thomas Malory, Knight. As Jesu help him for his great might, as he is the servant of Jesu, both day and night.